All right, good afternoon. My name is Will Ruger. I'm the president of the American Institute for Economic Research and a distinguished non-resident fellow with Defense Priorities. And as representative of Defense Priorities today, I would like to welcome you to this, I think, exciting virtual event on evaluating NATO enlargement from Cold War victory to the Russia-Ukraine war. So I think that we'll have an exciting time here today, and I do want to spend a little time introducing our distinguished panel, all of whom I consider to be great colleagues and friends, but hopefully we'll not just be too collegial, but we'll also have some exciting kind of discussions and debates, of course, done in a civil fashion that is consistent with how Defense Priorities and I like to approach these things. So we'll start with Josh Shifrinson. Josh Shifrinson is an associate professor of international relations at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy. His research focuses on international relations theory and international security, great power politics, U.S. grand strategy, and diplomatic history. And I have to mention this, Josh. You also share with me being in the coaching tree of the great Bob Art at Brandeis University. So it's great to have you, Josh.
It's great to be here, Will.
So next up, we'll have Susie Colbourn. Susie is the Associate Director of the Duke Program in American Grand Strategy at Duke University. She specializes in the history of the Cold War with a focus on NATO, the politics of European security, and the role of nuclear weapons in international politics and society. We're tremendously thrilled to have you here, Susie. And we also are excited by what you will be doing in the Duke program. So looking forward to seeing more. And then last but definitely not least is Jim Goldgeier. Jim is a professor of international relations at American University. His areas of expertise include contemporary international relations, American foreign policy, U.S.-Russia relations, the European Union, transatlantic security, and NATO. And I would be remiss if I didn't say something about Jim being a big advocate of what they call bridging the gap, bringing ideas, I think, across not only to policymakers, but to the general public at large in a way that is accessible, but not dumbed down. So, Jim, I've always admired that project, and I know you've been a key part of that. All right, well, why don't we start off? I'm going to hand off first to Josh, then to Susie, and then Jim will back clean up for us. But we'll have a great discussion after that. So Josh, you have the floor.
Great. Thank you, Will. And thanks to Susie and Jim for joining in as well today. What I want to do is provide a little bit of an overview of our volume, which is, by the way, available to anyone with a university affiliation via Springer academic link. Provide a little bit of background on how the volume came to be, speak a little bit to some of the overarching findings that this very broad interdisciplinary group of scholars and analysts, which we mobilized in the volume, really found, and then also say a few words of my own chapter examining the role of NATO enlargement in post-Cold War American foreign policy. I'm going to do this in about 5 minutes or less, or your money back. So the overview of the volume is simple. Way back in the Halicon days of 2018, Jim shot me an email suggesting that we combine forces and really discuss, try to delve a little further into the legacies of NATO expansion. You know, Jim and I have known each other for a number of years. We admire each other's work, yet we are on opposite sides. We're on opposite sides of whether we think NATO expansion was a net gain for the international arena. I'm a little more critical. Jim is a little more positive on that score. And yet we were both independently frustrated with how stagnant the debate has become. It was camps yelling at each other, taking really extreme positions, and not really offering a lot of nuance in terms of how NATO expansion occurred, the consequences for different actors involved. And so Jim reached out suggesting that we do something together. I proposed that we look at the issue by bringing together a group of scholars from Europe, from the United States, from Canada, and beyond to really examine the intricacies of NATO expansion. We had a workshop on this topic way back in 2019, published a special issue in International Politics back in 2020. And then tragically, with the escalation of the Russia-Ukraine war, or Russia's outright invasion of Ukraine back in 2022, Springer Springer reached out to ask us if we would revitalize and ask the authors to revisit their chapters to kind of update it and publish it as a special issue. The authors did so, and we're thrilled to see the results before you today. Now, as I mentioned, in this volume, we brought together an interdisciplinary and international group of scholars together to look at NATO expansion in multiple different facets. Because after all, NATO expansion wasn't just an issue for the United States. It wasn't just an issue potentially for Russia. It wasn't just an issue for the countries that joined NATO after the Cold War. It affected all these actors and others. And so, in general, we try to disaggregate the implications of NATO expansion for the United States, and I'll speak to that in my own remarks in just a second. For the non-American, long-standing NATO allies, like the states of Western Europe and Canada, as we try to look at the consequences of expansion for NATO as an organization, for the Central and Eastern European states that join NATO, and of course for countries outside of the NATO orbit, such as Russia and beyond that, China. In general, we found that NATO expansion actually has caused a lot of problems for the alliance itself in terms of setting strategic priorities and providing defense, providing hard security for the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, a debate we see playing out in real time as we look towards the upcoming NATO summit. It, in the process, also posed challenges to many of the Western European and Canadian and non-American allies, such as Canada, that were lukewarm about moving NATO's center of gravity further east, and at the same time were trying to cut their defense budgets after the Cold War, again raising questions over how they would provide, how the alliance could and would provide security for Central and Eastern Europe. It was actually a very complicated situation for the United States itself, because it did not, although NATO expansion helped maximize American influence over continental security affairs, it also required the United States to take on security burdens in Central and Eastern Europe of uncertain consequences to potential escalation in Central and Eastern Europe or beyond. But at the same time, expansion was likely a net gain for the Central and Eastern European states, which got extra security and got extra influence in the post-Cold War space than would otherwise be the case. And we're going to speak a little bit more to NATO expansion vis-a-vis Russia in the Q&A, so I'm going to hold off on discussing that. So if those are our macro findings, kind of painting a nuanced picture of how NATO expansion played out, what do I find in my own chapter looking at the role of NATO expansion in post-Cold War American foreign policy? Well, on the one hand, I think the consequences of expansion for the United States have been much more of a mixed bag than policymakers and analysts often acknowledge. On the positive side of the ledger, or the positive side from certain perspectives, expansion undoubtedly helped the U.S. Provide oversight over European security affairs. It provided American influence in parts of the continent that would not otherwise be influenced by the United States, or at least reinforced American influence in parts of the continent that would not have otherwise been directly influenced by the United States. It also guaranteed, to a certain extra extent, that Europe would not return to the internecine warfare of the pre-World War II years, all on the positive side of the ledger, at least from certain perspectives. The downsides, though, are pretty stark. It guaranteed that any conflicts in Eastern Europe would translate into problems for the United States. It also, I think, very clearly undermined, though it did not uniquely cause, U.S.-Russia tensions. It also involved the United States in a variety of missions around the periphery of Europe of questionable relevance to U.S. national security. Again, trying to paint a much more complicated, more nuanced picture than many sides in the policy debate often acknowledge. And part of the reason for this mixed bag, and part of the reason NATO expansion continued despite this mixed bag, is the fact that after the Cold War, with policymakers really embracing the idea of the United States having an opportunity to build what some call liberal order, I would just say exert oversight over many aspects of international relations, there was both little pushback externally and a little incentive internally to revisit the role of NATO expansion in the course of American foreign policy. So once the process began in the mid-1990s, a period that Jim has covered extensively in seminal research, it just became a runaway train where there was very little challenge to the idea or reason to revisit the assumptions undergirding NATO expansion. I think the recent Russia-Ukraine war has laid bare some of the questions, some of the assumptions, and posed questions to some of the assumptions. And we're seeing a debate play out in real time over whether NATO expansion will continue going forward. But I'll stop there and turn the floor over to Susie to speak to many other facets of the conversation.
Great, thanks, Josh. And Susie, you're up.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. It's really great to be here alongside Josh, Jim, and Will. Before I say anything about my own work, I want to thank everyone at Defense Priorities for putting this event together, particularly Ryan Knuckles, and for the invitation to be part of a panel with folks I admire and like so much. I'm very looking forward to our conversation. So in some ways, I think the task we have right now is a sort of an unenviable one. NATO's enlargement since the Cold War is a massive topic. And it's not one that lends itself easily to making opening remarks in the range of 3 to 5 minutes. And so with that as a sort of mea culpa, I want to make just 3 basic points to help frame our conversation, some of which draw on the chapter I contributed to the book that Josh and Jim put together, and some of which maybe take us beyond, but speak to a broader piece of the conversation at hand. So the first point I want to make is about expansion as a process. The second about the challenge facing policymakers at the end of the Cold War. And then a third reflection, maybe with my historian hat on, about why the history of NATO expansion and how we tell it matters so much today. So the first point I want to make is that the idea of expansion was baked into the very structure of NATO as an alliance from the 1940s. It did not suddenly emerge out of nowhere after the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 or the collapse of the Soviet Union in December of 1991. Even if we tend to associate it and use that shorthand to focus on one particular aspect of expansion, that is, the incorporation of states across Central and Eastern Europe, countries that for the most part had once been Moscow's treaty allies in the Warsaw Pact or part of the Soviet Union itself. But NATO expansion was much more and has been historically much more than just that process. The process of expansion predated the end of the Cold War. Article 10 of the North Atlantic Treaty, signed in 1949, laid out clear provisions for the potential incorporation of new members, and the negotiating talks in the late 1940s were filled with possible members who might one day join. NATO's ranks expanded on 3 different occasions during the Cold War. In 1952, to include Greece and Turkey in a round of expansion that at least one analyst in the 1990s debates called still the most problematic round of NATO expansion. In 1955, NATO expanded again to include the Federal Republic of Germany. And in 1982, once more to include Spain. To my mind, NATO's expansion to include new members is only one part of a much larger impulse in which the organization has constantly evolved. NATO is, at its very basic, an adaptive organization that has changed in size, in scope, and in priorities to meet with the perceived challenges of the times. Often, that has involved expansion in countless other forms, not just membership. Might be expanding committees, expanding priorities, expanding tasks, but NATO has pretty consistently shown an appetite to expand and contract, to reshape and remake itself, to continue staying in business. My second point is that the challenge facing the United States and its allies across NATO at the end of the Cold War was, at its most basic, one of integration. To put a sharper point on it, the task at hand revolved around how best to integrate the emerging democracies of Central and Eastern Europe, including the Soviet Union, into some sort of stable system. Now, that was a task of integration fraught with historical baggage. Central and Eastern European leaders and their citizens were, for the most part, and for good reason, wary of Moscow's intentions. And Moscow remained interested in being treated as a great power, despite having virtually none of the material circumstances that would make it a great power. Nuclear weapons, of course, being the notable exception. And a critical part of the question about integration was what these states could and would be integrated into, and what formats or organizations would best achieve the various allies' strategic goals, both in the immediate future and over the long-term horizon. From our vantage point in the 2020s, I think it's easy to speculate that the allies, including but not limited to the United States, should have been prescient enough to see that the Cold War was ending in 1989, that leaders like George Bush, James Baker, and Brent Scowcroft might have or should have been bolder in their vision. I think it is a case that is easy to make in retrospect. But if we move forward in time from the 1970s and the 1980s, as they did, it becomes a lot more difficult to imagine when they might have wrapped the whole thing up. I'm happy to talk a little bit about the counterfactuals with Josh and Jim in our back and forth after this. Third, and finally, as a sort of noted conclusion, and picking up on something Josh said in his remarks, the way we talk about NATO expansion and how we got to our current moment, I think, is not just an academic subject of debate of interest to historians and political scientists. NATO expansion has long been seen as a broader litmus test in this country for how one views the United States' role in the world. But we also have a sometimes troubling, at least to somebody who is only half American, we have a sometimes troubling tendency to conflate NATO expansion and US foreign policy as though they are one and the same. It's all too easy to ignore the degree to which other actors, whether that's the old allies of the United States in NATO or prospective new allies, shaped the process and debates over NATO's expansion. And so, to that end, my chapter in the book highlights a very different perspective, one that doesn't get a lot of love, that of Canadian officials in the 1990s. And the point I make is a very simple one, that many of the things we associate with the United States and its prerogatives and foreign policy priorities in the early 1990s were not actually unique to the United States. Canadian officials, for instance, also cared deeply about keeping NATO intact in the 1990s for many of the same reasons as the United States. They saw it as a way to maintain their own link to Europe and to remain a European power even after the Cold War. With that, I will leave it there and hand it over to Jim and look forward to our conversation.
All right, Jim, you bring us home to the discussion.
Great. Well, really appreciate the opportunity to be joining everyone. Thanks to Ryan for hosting, Will for agreeing to moderate, and for his contribution to this volume. It's great to hear from Josh and Susie, and really terrific chapter by Susie, and really important to have the perspective of the Canadian approach to this issue, which, as she points out, is often neglected. I've really enjoyed the opportunity to work with Josh on these issues over the last few years. I became so frustrated with the debate over NATO enlargement, and it was important for me to work with someone who had a different view on enlargement than I do. People often ask me, how can you work with Shifrinson? You guys don't agree. And I always say, yeah, that's the point, to improve the debate. What we do agree on is sort of how to go about thinking about the debate and about how to evaluate the policy, even if we disagree on the merits of the policy that was chosen and the costs and benefits of the policies that weren't chosen. And I think especially for students watching or aspiring policymakers, it's really important when we have this debate about NATO enlargement and you hear, greatest thing ever, or, biggest mistake ever. Well, compared to what? All policies have costs and benefits. And the policy that was chosen certainly had its costs and benefits. Particularly, benefits to Central and Eastern Europe and the security across that swath of Europe. Certainly had its costs in terms of contributing to the deterioration of relations with Russia. I think one of the most interesting things about the book is the inclusion of chapters on the impact of NATO as an institution and the mixed impact that enlargement had on NATO as an institution. But I just want to say in just a few minutes, sort of just thinking about NATO enlargement versus its alternatives. Josh and I, as we've worked on this subject, have sort of clarified, the alternative policies to the one that was chosen. We do focus on NATO-centric policies, as we call them, because once the United States made that decision that it wanted NATO to continue, in order for the United States to remain dominant in European security, the really cut off, and Josh has shown this very well in his own archival work and the implications of what he's found, really shut off sort of alternatives, focus on the EU, focus on what became the OSCE. But even if we talk about NATO as the central institution for Europe going forward, there were at least three alternatives. One was to pursue the Partnership for Peace that was announced in January of 1994, a program that connected militaries of all the former Warsaw Pact and former Soviet states to try to increase sort of military to military cooperation and get the militaries on board with reform in these post-communist countries. And, you know, there were plenty of people, especially at the Pentagon, who thought the Partnership for Peace should be the focus, and that should, you know, sort of ensure that NATO enlargement was put off to some much later date, or even not pursued. And, you know, that had its own costs and benefits. You know, certainly might have made the U.S.-Russia relationship easier, the West's relationship with Russia. But it would also have had cost in terms of, you know, the ability of Central and Eastern Europe to integrate with the West. And I would argue probably would have hindered their accession to the European Union, given the role that NATO plays in security. But that was certainly an alternative that needs to be weighed against enlargement. A second is to have invited Russia to join. You know, people laugh when I say this, and certainly it's hard to imagine Russia ever having been invited to join, but it was a live issue between 1991 and 2001 at various points. Boris Yeltsin, the president of Russia, raised it. Vladimir Putin, when he assumed the presidency of Russia, raised it. It was first raised in December of 1991, a very dramatic moment, meeting at NATO, where the Soviet ambassador left the room, came back in and said, I no longer represent the Soviet Union, I represent the Russian Federation, and my president, Boris Yeltsin, would like to join NATO. And, you know, for about 10 years, you know, it was raised as a possibility. Susie mentioned the open door policy, NATO, the Article 10, the way this is built in, meant theoretically a democratic Russia could join. Obviously, that would have alleviated some of the issues in U.S.-Russia relations, would have had an enormous impact on NATO as an institution, and would have created, you know, a set of problems in terms of internal dynamics. The last that I know of that it was taken seriously was 2001. There was a memo that Richard Haas asked his staff on the policy planning staff to send forward, a memo that was drafted by Angela Stent and is discussed in her book, The Limits of Partnership, that you know, it was time to invite Russia to join. And, you know, again, hard to know how seriously to take this, but it was certainly discussed, and it's an option that should be weighed against the policy chosen. And finally, the last one is a policy of enlargement that included some of that enlargement, but not necessarily all of it. And just my own personal view on enlargement, I think the 1999 and 2004 rounds of enlargement were, while they were irritating to Russia, were accepted by Russia, and were hugely beneficial for European security and the security across Central and Eastern Europe, and important for those countries. And a reminder that, you know, they wanted to join the institution. This wasn't forced on them. Just as, for example, Finland, which recently joined, also wanted to join. It wasn't forced on Finland, and hopefully Sweden will join soon. To me, the big moment in this whole enlargement process was 2008, the Bucharest Declaration, the summit declaration at NATO that said Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. It didn't provide those countries with a path. It certainly angered the Russians. I don't think it was a necessary statement to make. And I think that that absent that statement, I think we would probably have been in a different place with respect to enlargement. And it's a theme that's well laid out by current CIA Director Bill Burns in his memoir, The Back Channel. And the last thing I would just say is that, you know, there are people who pinpoint the cause of the expansion of the Russia-Ukraine war to NATO membership. I myself don't feel that NATO contributed much to the outbreak of the war. I think it is largely due to imperialist attitudes and to Putin's desire that you know, that he become the new Peter the Great and gather in what he considers to be these Russian territories. And I think NATO is a critically important institution for pushing back against that Russian imperialism, trying to contain it, and supporting Ukraine so that hopefully it can defeat Russia.
Thanks, Jim. That was great. And thank you all. I think it gave us a lot to talk about. And again, just to kind of restate this, all these members on the screen right now wrote pieces for this book that Jim and Josh put together called Evaluating NATO Enlargement from Cold War Victory to the Russia-Ukraine War, which I really recommend and is incredibly timely. Which is it continues to be the gift that keeps on giving, right, Jim and Josh? And
Tragically,
unfortunately, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But that is the nature of our field in some ways. But I want to kind of talk about some of your prior research that I know well, and to kind of dig into some of these issues that are touched on in that research. And one of these would be this issue about what the United States promised Russia at the end of the Cold War. So I guess I'll start with you, Josh, but I'm open to everyone jumping in. What is your view based on your archival work of whether the United States promised anything to Russia about the enlargement of NATO, including the quote unquote not 1 inch question?
Right. No, thanks, Will. This is in some ways my gateway drug. I got into NATO issues largely because I don't study NATO. I want to confess that I don't consider myself a researcher of NATO, but I study American foreign policy, particularly towards Europe and Asia. And I ended up writing an article back in 2016 for International Security entitled "Deal or No Deal: The 1990 Conversations About NATO Expansion." And there, I found pretty significant archival evidence that American policymakers in the George H.W. Bush administration repeatedly signaled throughout this winter and spring of 1990 that NATO would not enlarge, would not move further into Central and Eastern Europe if the then Soviet Union, not Russia, but then Soviet Union, allowed Germany to reunify within NATO. That was the live issue of the day. These assurances, and I avoid the word promises or pledges because diplomacy hangs on assurances. I'll use the phrase assurances here. These assurances were given by then Secretary of State Jim Baker, repeated by then Deputy National Security Advisor Bob Gates. They were reinforced by conversations that President Bush and then Soviet Soviet President at the time, Mikhail Gorbachev, had throughout the spring of 1990. And I think it's crystal clear that there were these assurances given at the time that if the Soviets conceded on German reunification, the Americans, understanding Soviet interests, would not allow NATO to enlarge, I should say, further to the east. This framework hinges large in the fact that NATO operates via consensus. So if the US said, no, I will not support NATO expansion, then NATO was not going to expand. Now, it's not just American archival documents. When I was digging through the British National Archives a few years back, I actually found a memo of a meeting of the NATO Quad, meeting the political directors for the United States, Germany, Britain, and France, meeting in March of 1991, where all the policymakers in the room said, we told the Soviets that we could not expand NATO, so we really can't expand NATO going forward. At the time, there were the first inklings that NATO might expand further to the east. Now, I think I think it's very clear that there were these assurances given. One of the questions is whether the Soviets should have really trusted these pledges. After all, international politics is about power. The Soviets were a declining into fragment state. I think the Soviets probably should have been pushed for some sort of firmer diplomatic deal that would allow them to, wave the piece of paper in the air and point out any changes in the American position. And I'm not surprised that the United States later chose to go back on these assurances. But to the key question, whether there were assurances, yes, there were, and whether the U.S. harmed its credibility in the world or harmed its credibility in the eyes of Russia, I think that's also a very plausible interpretation of the violation of these assurances in 1990.
Thanks, Josh. Jim, Susie, do you agree with Josh? And whether you agree or not, what happened? Well, international politics happened, yes, but what in particular? Why did we see many inches taken?
Go ahead, Susie. You're the NATO expert of the four of us, so
and the real historian.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things is that you can look at the same documents and come to dramatically different conclusions, especially when you are talking about intangible things like context, like what is the difference between a pledge, a promise, an assurance, whatever taxonomy you'd like to make. So much of the debate, which is hotly contested and seems to very coincidentally always come around exactly the time the Russians decide to invade one of their neighbors, say. I wonder why that just happens to coincide. It is this idea, much of this debate hangs on this set of conversations that happened in February of 1990 between James Baker and Mikhail Gorbachev. And Baker, interestingly, over a few days, repeated a few different formulations. They never came out sort of in exactly the same phrasing every time, but floating the possibility that NATO might not expand its jurisdiction not 1 inch to the east, right? Hence this not 1 inch phrase that Mary Serrati's recent book has made so well known. But the problem with that is that those meetings, so Josh has read those transcripts in one way, I would read those transcripts in another way, which is to say that Baker floated the idea. It was an idea that Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the West German foreign minister, had already floated publicly in a speech at the end of January 1990, so about 9 days earlier. And then the meeting ends between Gorbachev and Baker, and there's no agreement. They don't come away having decided on anything. It is an idea discussed, and an idea, like many in the process of German unification, that ended up outpaced by events, by the fact that the German Democratic Republic was collapsing and what was viable and plausible changed rapidly, and frankly, that the Soviet Union and its position was eroding dramatically. And so I am not surprised that Russian policymakers like to point to that moment as one of great leverage, but I think it's very easy to make more of it than there was. Yes, there were public statements and public speculation about how you might restrict NATO's expansion to the east, particularly in the context of the German Democratic Republic, in order to reassure the Soviet Union. But at the end of the day, the agreement that was signed on paper was very specific about what those restrictions would look like, which were confined to not stationing NATO forces on the lands of the GDR while Soviet forces were still withdrawing.
Jim, what's your take on that? And I also want to ask you about the effects of this on perceptions in Russia going forward during the post-Cold War era, or what became the post-Cold War era.
Yeah, what's interesting, I mean, it's so interesting, to hear two experts. I mean, Josh has really done so much digging on that particular issue in the documents, and Susie knows them well, and has done her own historical research and has a good sense of what they mean. And I just, I mean, on this specific issue, just emphasize a point with respect to the negotiations that Susie has alluded to. In my view, Gorbachev had choices to make about what he was going to insist on, and what he most wanted was cash, and that's what he took, and he got it over the summer. Didn't end up doing him as much good as he had hoped, but he got the cash. I would just step back and think about a broader set of assurances, which I do think the United States and its allies made, and believes that it implemented, and that the Russians, of course, see it very differently. I think the assurances were that as the Soviet Union and Russia retreat from its position in Europe, that the West would not take advantage of that to undermine Russian security. And you have a whole set of initiatives that were undertaken. The effort to make clear that NATO was becoming more of a political institution rather than a military alliance. The arms control reduction of heavy weapons on both sides through the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty. The huge reduction in U.S. forces in Europe to try to signal that the United States wasn't going to maintain that kind of military presence in Europe. As things go on, the invitation and acceptance by Russia to join the Partnership for Peace, the invitation by Russia to join the implementation force after the conclusion of the Dayton Accords in 1995 and the war in Bosnia, the signing of the NATO-Russia Founding Act in 1997, to try to give Russia more assurances about what the process of enlargement would mean. From a U.S. perspective, and I think from a larger NATO Western perspective, there were assurances given about not taking advantage of Russian security, and I think the West felt that it was delivering on those. Of course, the Russians looked at this and said, wait a minute, what the heck? Like, NATO's just coming closer and closer to our borders, and that is undermining our security. I just feel like that's just an unbridgeable divide between the two sides. And I think that, I think for me, the most important thing is that when there's some notion that the West betrayed Russia and the West went back on its word, I don't think that's the case. But I think it's easy for Putin to make that claim, and especially with some of the comments that were made at the time. And I think the desire of the Russians not to see this move forward. The one last thing I'll say is, I did a piece some years ago on 1993 conversations between Warren Christopher and Boris Yeltsin, which I find more important because Gorbachev and Bush were off stage pretty quickly after all this took place, and most of the action took place in the Clinton-Yeltsin years. And there was a meeting in October of 1993 where Warren Christopher explained that NATO was going to move forward with the Partnership for Peace in January of 94. And Yeltsin was visibly relieved. I mean, he thought he had dodged a bullet. He thought this wasn't going to happen. Phew, tell Bill this is, he's a genius. This is brilliant. And, they thought that Partnership for Peace was going to be it. And then, less than a year later, September 94, Clinton is telling Yeltsin that, in fact, enlargement is moving forward. But he was going to do it slowly so that it didn't get in the way of Yeltsin's 1996 reelection. So I think there were a lot of efforts here, but no question the perceptions matter, as we know.
Yeah. So one question, and we'll get out of the 90s here soon and get closer to today. But one question is, do you all consider there to be kind of different levels of challenge or of opportunity, depending on how you're looking at it, which side you're looking at it, of the different rounds of NATO enlargement? In other words, was the round that brought Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic in very different than, say, the round that brought the Baltics in, and certainly than the potential that was exhibited at Bucharest for Ukraine and Georgia? So, Josh, why don't I start with you there?
Sure, you're letting me answer the easy questions. No, yeah, I think you're 100% right, Will. I think there is a fundamental difference between NATO enlarging to include Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary in 1999 after their earlier invitation, and then the subsequent rounds of enlargement, certainly 04 and then 08 and beyond. I think that's important for two different reasons. Number one, if you're just thinking about the map of Europe and the potential for NATO to be drawn into some kind of kerfluffle with post-Cold War Russia, the fact that you have Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, A, having significant military potential of their own, and then B, still being fairly far away from Russia itself, holding Kaliningrad aside for the time being, just means that they may, on the margin, provide, it may not be a net loss for NATO, and they don't immediately involve the potential for escalation vis-a-vis Russia. When you start talking about enlarging to include the Baltic states in particular, and then beyond to include Ukraine, Georgia, and others, you're talking about states that used to be part of the Soviet Union, used to be part of the Russian Empire, wrongly. These are colonial expeditions, the colonial involvements in some case, but nevertheless, we see the world as it is. These are countries that are immediately adjacent to Russia, that have long and bad histories with Russia, and so involve real escalation risks and have real political baggage in Moscow. So I think those subsequent rounds of enlargement carry real political consequences, real diplomatic consequences that the first round of enlargement at least did not. I'll just say too, and on this point I can't help but throw out, if you actually have good archival access to what the Russians were saying in the 1990s, if you look at the British archives and the 2000s for that matter. And in fact, the British, talking to the Russians, as are the Americans, the British are begging the Americans to stop NATO expansion after the first round because it has such different consequences vis-a-vis Russia. So I think there is a fundamental difference here between across the different rounds of enlargement, in exactly the way you alluded to.
Yeah, Susie, since you're an expert on the NATO as an institution itself, what were those conversations like within NATO when it came to the challenge of actually trying to deter and defend on behalf of new entrants as they came in?
It's a good question because I think it gets at sort of a fundamental paradox at the heart of NATO, which is how successful the organization has ever been in its planning to defend the territory that is part of NATO. So we talk a lot in conversations that are focused on expansion or enlargement in the 1990s and beyond about how indefensible that position was. But many of those same policymakers had been struggling with a position they found indefensible for 40 years. I mean, figuring out how you were going to defend West Berlin was not exactly the easiest strategic circle to square, or pick your metaphor. And so I think a lot of it hinged on what historians of NATO, including myself, have referred to as wishful thinking, right? There was always a degree of implausibility in NATO's planning that was a hope that deterrence would hold so that you didn't have to do the difficult work. And there was always a little bit of hope that things would obtain. And so I don't think it's very surprising that some of those hopes or wish casting stuck with the alliance and its strategic planning into the 1990s and 2000s. But on the question of the rounds themselves, I think there's an interesting paradox because it's easy to look at them as discrete rounds. But I would come back to something Josh said in his opening remarks, which is that in 1997, when the offer was made to the Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary to join at the Madrid summit, it was already clear that there was a sort of built-in momentum. Commentators at the time talked about a sense of built-in future rounds, right? That a process was underway. And even before the Madrid summit, critics of the Clinton administration, many of them Republicans, were already writing openly in the Washington Post, talking about how the Baltics had to be next. And so it's easy to disaggregate in separate rounds in one way. And in another way, the politics were always so bound up. The place where I would break out as a very different round is 2008 and Bucharest, as Jim already referred to, which is the sort of worst of both worlds scenario, in which the United States pushes heavily for Ukraine and Georgia, France and Germany, and to a lesser extent the United Kingdom were very, very reluctant. And instead of one party carrying the day, they sort of ended up with this: the door is open, we'll do nothing to move you any closer to the door, which really undermined, I think, the credibility of the alliance from an alliance perspective, hung out a whole bunch of dirty laundry about how the allies couldn't agree about who should join. And then also, at the end of the day, if the goal was to make Ukraine or Georgia more secure, it failed in doing that.
Yeah. Hey, Josh, if you could hold that. I think this is a perfect bridge, and you can touch on what you want to, Josh, but I think this is a perfect bridge to the present, right? And I'm going to go to Jim here and then you, Josh, which is, okay, so we've got this enlargement. It's happening in stages. It's moving further and further east, right as Josh said, into the former Soviet Union states. All right, Jim, did this contribute in any way to the war in Ukraine that we see today?
Well, I think, it certainly contributed to the deterioration of the West's relations with Russia. I don't really see it as contributing directly to the war itself. As I said, I think Putin had other reasons for this. It was clear that NATO wasn't going to be including Ukraine. I think he was much more concerned that Ukraine was generally, after his invasion of 2014, Ukraine started thinking more about being part of the West, and it was also becoming more successful with its own democracy. And I think he feared that his chance of grabbing this territory was slipping away. He may have been encouraged by the fact that the Biden administration came in with a clear focus on China, and maybe he thought that it wouldn't, be engaged in this. May have been encouraged by the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan. Who knows what his thinking was. But I think, you know, when we think about enlargement, I would just say two things. One, you know, because of this war, Finland and Sweden decided they should join. And I think when we, you know, Finland's now in, so, you know, hopefully Sweden will be, but just let's take Finland, you know, as a new member. You know, it does so many things. And you think then about the other members that have come in. Finland is strategically important. It's an established democracy. And you know, it has a major, it can make a major contribution to NATO as a military alliance. And I think that can help us think about, you know, not all of the countries that have come in have those three features.
Yeah, I mean, Finland does have a lot of those benefits, but what's the size of that border, Jim, with Russia?
But you know, I mean, I think we see that Putin really he isn't concerned about NATO's threat to Russia, because otherwise he wouldn't have left the border completely open to pursue this war in Ukraine. I think the fact that he's moved all those forces out of the north is a sign that he knows NATO's not going to attack Russia. You know, I actually think, you know, that border is much less important, you know, from a NATO perspective than it was before, because Putin has shifted so many resources down to the south. So I think Finland makes a net contribution. I also think that what we've seen, given the Russian imperialism, I don't really see any other option to deal with that other than bringing countries into NATO. And that's why while I opposed the 2008 Bucharest Declaration, I believe it's time for the West to pursue bringing Ukraine into NATO.
Mm-hmm. Josh, what's your thoughts on these questions? There's a lot on the table.
Yeah, there's a lot on the table. Again, I want to clarify. I don't study NATO and I don't study Russia, so I'm a dangerous person to comment on these issues. But let me try to offer what I've learned in the course of doing this volume, listening to Jim, Kim Martin, Bill Woolforth, Susie, and other really smart and savvy analysts. You know, I see a lot of the Ukraine war, the cause of the Ukraine war. It's ultimately coming down to a long-standing spiral between the U.S. and Russia and others over really what shall be the parameters of European security. In other words, if NATO is going to be the lodestone of where most of the European security decisions are made, you know, how will Russian interests, which, you know, may be imperial in their nature, but rightly or wrongly, Russia sees as its interests, how will they be heard and acted upon? You know, as Jim alluded to in the 1990s and afterwards, American policymakers really tried to lead Russian policymakers to understand that the U.S. heard Russian interests. I think as NATO began expanding further and further into Central and Eastern Europe, I think Russian policymakers began worrying that maybe their interests in a deep sense of the term, as they understood them, rightly or wrongly here, as they understood them, really weren't being heard. And I think Ukraine was, as Bill Burns as cabled from Moscow when he was ambassador, the brightest of all red lines for the Russian security apparatus, not just Putin, not just certain elites around him, but really the Russian elite, including Navalny, who has said certain things about Ukraine, which are problematic. And in that sense, I think when you see Bucharest and then you see subsequent to 2014, U.S. and NATO involvement in Ukraine growing, and then we see in the fall of 2021, the U.S. increasing its involvement in Ukraine, signing agreements with Ukraine diplomatically and militarily. It looks like, I could understand why from a Russian perspective, it looks like this country, which you think you have to have influence over, is being hardened and being taken into NATO by proxy, or at least slowly over time. I think that was a misjudgment on Russia's part, but I can understand where the assessment comes from. So in that sense, I'm not surprised. I think it's tragic. I think it's unjust, but I'm not surprised that Russia chose to invade into those conditions, because after all, as I just laid out, Russia would be having very little of a negotiating partner in the United States, and having its interests being sidestepped by the United States, despite the assurances of the 1990s and after. It would see Ukraine, this country that it believes it has to have influence over, becoming more integrated with the West, again, for legitimate reasons from Ukraine's perspective. And under those conditions, I'm not surprised, though I'm saddened and I'm really morally repulsed by the Russian decision to invade to solve the problem, to impose a unilateral solution. I think that is unjust. I think it's tragic. I think it's horrible, but I'm not surprised. And I think I can understand it from a NATO enlargement perspective.
Sure. Susie, you want to jump in here before we move to the next question?
Yeah, I would just say that in some ways it takes us back to a fundamental paradox that had plagued the debate over whether NATO enlargement was a good idea throughout the 1990s and beyond. You had Central and Eastern European leaders who their primary case for why they should be brought into NATO was fundamentally about the trajectory of Moscow, right? They looked to the past to understand what the future might look like, and often came away with the sense that Moscow viewed certain parts of the continent as its rightful territory, and that as hedging their bets to plan safely for the future, they should assume that it was entirely possible that future leaders in Moscow might do the same, right? And so Polish officials, for instance, used to talk in 1993 about the idea of expansion as a way to cage the bear, right? It was a good time to build an architecture that could contain Russian intentions. And so I think there always has been this tension about what expansion was trying to achieve. And here I would say, and maybe this is my historian showing, but it's complicated. We look at the world now and want to hope that there was some wonderful missed opportunity, that we could have done something differently and prevented horrible things like the human rights violations Russian forces are perpetrating, war crimes Russian forces are perpetrating against Ukrainian civilians, right? We want to hope that we could have done something to stop that. But I think there was a fundamentally difficult policy puzzle in the 1990s that continues on to today, which was, could you really integrate Central and Eastern Europe and integrate Russia in ways that would make both of them happy? And I find very little evidence in the 1990s that that was possible. But I think maybe where I would just add a few thoughts to what Josh said and then hand it back to Jim is to say that I think there is a difference between acknowledging that and absolving in any way the choices that Vladimir Putin and Russian leaders have made. I think that ultimately, I'm very wary of going down the road of saying NATO expansion was responsible for this, because I think that ultimately the choice to deny Ukrainian sovereignty, to deny Ukrainians the chance to live in the kind of country they wish to live in, which is not one dominated by Moscow, is ultimately a product of Russian imperial thinking and a Russian imperial past that has on occasion intersected with NATO, but is not a product of NATO.
So Jim, you opposed the Bucharest Declaration, but now you think that Ukraine should be a member. So my question is, from an American perspective, not a Ukrainian perspective, but from an American perspective, if Ukraine was not so vitally important to secure America's national interests in 2008, why is it in America's interest to add Ukraine now? And if the answer is it's not, but it's in Ukraine's interest, tell me why we should be approaching, why we should care about that.
So I first of all, I have changed my mind on Ukraine coming in to NATO because of what's happened, and my own thinking about how to secure Ukraine and what that means for European security, which is an American interest. I was opposed to the 2008 declaration. Again, it made a statement without providing a path, but also, angered the Russians. Bill Burns had been warning about this from Moscow, about sort of a red line, and the United States and the West, needlessly provoked Putin. I think obviously now we're past the point of provoking. I mean, Putin has launched this major war, trying to take this as much territory as he can, or hang on to as much now. So I'm discounting the provoking now that concerned me in 2008. And I just look at the Russian imperialism and think, this is not just Putin, and it's not just the elite. These are deep-seated attitudes. We've seen this clearly since February of 22, how deep-seated these are in the population. What do you do about that Russian imperialism? because, can this war end? I don't think there's going to be a formal peace settlement. I think Russia, certainly as long as Putin is power, is going to continue to pose the threat of military action against Ukraine, even if the fighting were somehow to stop this year or, soon after. And I think, what I'd love to see is a Russia that was a post-imperial Russia that said, we're content to live within our 1991 internationally recognized borders. And we would like to talk about how to, ensure our security within those borders. I think the West would jump at the chance for that conversation. But I don't see Russia being post-imperial anytime soon. And so that means to prevent that kind of aggression, we need to be able to contain the Russian aggression. And so that's why I've concluded that really the only way to solve this goes beyond just arming Ukraine, the porcupine notion that you just give Ukraine what it needs to defend itself against a future Russian assault, but that in fact, you need to bring Ukraine into NATO and then hopefully into the European Union. And, hopefully as much of Ukraine is independent as possible at that point. But I have certainly changed my mind in favor of that. And I see it as important for European security, which is important for American security.
Yeah, Josh, do you think that this framing of the challenge around Russian imperialism is the kind of way you think about it as a well-known realist? And then how do you think about, again, whether Ukraine is it in America's national interest for Ukraine to be part of NATO?
Yes, self-identified and card-carrying realists. McCarthy is looking for me. So I guess I come back to what I said. Russia may be imperialist. It may not be. I guess I come back to realists see the world as it is, and Russia has defined its interest to include significant influence over its near abroad. It seems to me on that basis, I don't, unless the US and other NATO allies really want to have a ongoing militarized standoff with Moscow, and I'll applaud President Biden and his team here for really avoiding real risks of military escalation between NATO and Russia, except for a few moments during the conflict. I think if you take Ukraine or Georgia or certain other states into NATO, you're going to be involved in a situation where you're talking about a real military standoff that looks a lot more like like the Cold War, where there's a real risk of military escalation along the way. I will just say, I'll also say that one thing that we have to talk about if we're going to really consider NATO expansion to include Ukraine is actually revises the terms under which NATO expansion will occur. One of the requirements for NATO expansion in times past is that countries have peaceable relations with their neighbors. I think it would be hard pressed to argue that Ukraine and Russia have peaceful relations today. So in a way, to expand NATO to include Ukraine actually changes the terms under which NATO is considering enlargement now and for the future. So I think there are some real risks for the United States. I think there are some real dangers here. And given other American priorities at home and abroad, I am really reluctant to take on an ongoing heavy military challenge in Ukraine, all the more so because tragically, Ukraine just isn't central to the future of European security in hard material power terms. I'll put my realist card on the table on that.
So we're going to close here because I want to be respectful of our audience's time. So we're all going to have 1 minute. But before we do that, taking a page from my friend Tyler Cowen, I'll have like kind of a lightning round thing. So do we close the open door to Georgia? Yes or no, Josh?
It's already closed. Now let's nail it shut.
Susie?
No.
Jim?
No, because I think it's built into Article 10, as Susie pointed out before, and I don't think NATO should be in the business of saying who qualifies and who doesn't. Article 10 makes clear that any European state that contributes to alliance security and meets the criteria for joining should be invited. So I don't think it should be.
So Georgia is a North Atlantic state, huh? All right, so let's take a minute. I want to give everybody their due. What do you want to tell this audience about the subject of NATO enlargement, about NATO's future, about Ukraine, or about Georgia? And what we just talked about at the end. But I'm going to go in reverse order from the beginning. Jim, you have the first word here, and again, any of those things you want to mention, please go ahead.
Thanks. Well, first of all, thanks for moderating this. It's great to be with everyone. And I would just say, to reiterate what I said earlier about sort of how we think about this policy, we have to look at the pros and cons of the policy chosen, and then we have to compare it to the pros and cons of the other potential policies. You can't just look at enlargement in a vacuum. And no policy is perfect. There were issues that were resolved with enlargement, and there were issues that were left unresolved. But I think especially for students who are watching this, please think about this in the context of how you compare and contrast pros and cons of policies chosen versus their alternatives.
Great, thank you, Jim. And the historical context is so important, as one of the reasons why we wanted Susie here. So Susie, last minute here for you.
Yeah, I would say two things. One, an old hobby horse of mine, right? The history of NATO and the history of NATO expansion is not the history of US foreign policy. And it's important to know both of them, but those are two separate questions, and both worthy of study and consideration in their own right. The second is that NATO expansion is not a static process, right? We tend to use one terminology, but the conversation about NATO expansion in 1954 was very different than the conversation of NATO expansion in 1996, in 2007, in 2023. And so thinking about it as an ever-moving target and situating it, embedding it in how the dilemmas, debates, and context have changed is critical, I think, no matter where you come down on the debate. And it's okay to change your mind when the context changes.
Great. Thank you, Susie. Josh. 1 minute. 1 minute, or your money back. So I come down to the fact that not only do we need to discuss NATO expansion historically and recognize that NATO expansion is not American foreign policy, not just that the policy needs to be evaluated relative to the counterfactuals, but that we also need to recognize the nuances involved, right? One of the virtues of working with Jim and working with others with whom I admire immensely, with whom I sometimes disagree, is that you're able to come up with a fuller, more nuanced, caveated picture, because policy is often made in a gray space between extremes. And I think so it goes to NATO expansion. I've come away convinced that NATO expansion has increasingly posed costs, risks, and dilemmas for U.S. foreign policy. I'll emphasize U.S. foreign policy. I recognize, though, that NATO expansion has been incredibly beneficial for many of the Central and Eastern European states. If I was Ukrainian, I would want to join NATO today. And I recognize that these different perspectives all deserve a place at the table and to be aired and to be evaluated against one another. There's no hard and fast rule that says one country's perspective wins. It's a question of how we make policy, recognizing and engaging these multiple audiences.
Well, thank you, everyone. And I do want to highlight that Jim and Josh did a great service, I think, to the study of this issue and for, I think, the issue of policy. They bridged the gap greatly with this volume. So thank you, Jim and Josh. I'm a beneficiary, along with Raj Menon, of being asked to write a chapter for this book, and I really appreciated that as well. And Susie, obviously, great to have your voice here as our expert on NATO. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And this was fantastic. I certainly learned something, and I'm looking forward to future engagement with all three of you in the future. So thank you very much on behalf of Defense Priorities. This is our great event on evaluating NATO enlargement. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.